Don't worry too much about my having all these notes out here. My oblate brothers all tell me that what I lack in the quality of my preaching, I more than make up with in the extended length of my preaching. You know, I've had the privilege of participating for several years in the Novena. I've preached a couple different years on different topics, and as I hear all the different topics that we choose from year to year, it never ceases to amaze me the many different ways in which human beings can and do suffer, and suffer greatly. I think back to when I was working in inner city Chicago and one of my fellow oblates looking at the extreme poverty and violence there at Precious Blood Parish on the west side. He said, you know, the human heart wasn't made for so much suffering. And it's true. And yet, as you look at the strength of people who do suffer and what they teach us about what it means to be faithful, it never ceases to humble missionaries like myself and my fellow religious brothers, sisters, priests who do work with the poorest of the poor and often teach us what it means to be messengers of God's healing and hope. And whether I'm working with folks who are poor or well-to-do or somewhere in between, I've noticed that there are often three things which narrow that gap and help the poor and the wealthy come together when they really talk about their suffering. Three things every human being shares in common across divides of culture or economy or gender or race or anything. Physical health, broken relationships, and death of a loved one. These are all the things that we often really pour out our heart to others about and give our heart over to others who are suffering when they deal with these things. And there are also two things which seem to bring the most comfort no matter where you stand in life. Those things are the embrace of a loving community and faith in God, whatever that God may look like, and whatever faith someone may profess. The things that bring us together in our suffering and the things that bring us together in our healing are often very, very common human experiences. And they're all brought together in this encounter of Jesus, the woman with the hemorrhage, and Jairus and his daughter. If we look at how Jesus lived in his day and approached the issue of physical illness, we need to look at the Old Testament, and there are two very strong traditions in the Old Testament, and what is kind of ugly for us. Very often people in that day faced any kind of sickness with fear, with terror, with rejection. They faced it with depression and in anger. Now, anyone who's faced a serious illness might recognize at least a few of those in themselves or someone they know as well. So those qualities are not foreign today. They were certainly there in Jesus' day, but it went even deeper for this reason. For the people of the covenant of the Old Testament, very often they equated any human suffering with a sign that not just that person, but they themselves as a Hebrew people had broken the covenant, because any one or two may have broken the covenant. So anyone's suffering was a sign not just on that person, but on them all. So you take these difficulties and add to them the weight of guilt and shame which must have been felt by the woman who had the hemorrhage for 13 years, and even the synagogue official, an upstanding, wealthy, powerful man, to have his young daughter die. What must have happened in the past in that family? How can we trust him? As tragic as the loss of health or a child are, these people have either completely lost or are about to lose all their social support and standing. Remember the two things I said that often heal? Faith in God and the support of a loving community. In Jesus' day, people who clung to that aspect of the Hebrew tradition denied people who were sick those very things which helped them continue and heal. Such bigotry was not unique to Jesus' day. We can all imagine the different things we see on the news with, we all know the name of the church, I need not even mention it. When a soldier dies, and they go and protest at the soldier's funeral, saying that it's the result of sins other people have done. How sickening a response that is. That's how it must have been for Jairus and for the woman with the hemorrhage. To have that kind of view of them because one of their loved ones or they themselves were ill or near death. It's disgusting that a handful of misguided folks could be so visible. Why is it that the idiots always get in front of the news cameras? By the way, this is not a news camera, okay? This is not news. This is a video recording. And yet, thankfully, Jesus had access to an alternate vision as well. Because also in the New Testament, in the Psalms and the prophets, you find a very different picture of God's response to those who are ill. We learned about a God who has compassion and mercy, forgiving sins and healing the sick. We find people who do not stand in fear of God, as in trembling and concerned that they're going to be condemned to hell forever. But we find people who turn to God asking for mercy. And Jesus takes a very clear stand in his ministry. He knows which side he is on, and anyone who reads Jesus' sayings in the Gospels with at least an ounce of common sense can't help but notice where Jesus stands. In all the stories up to this point at Mark, Jesus has healed. He has proclaimed a divine healing, as did the prophets and the poets. And not only has he proclaimed it, he has produced it as well. Whether lepers or lame, whether blind or bedeviled or bleeding, whether shamed or shunned or shivering from fevers, Jesus took charge and physically cured those who sought him. But he does more. He is not simply a miracle worker in the medical field. He physically cures, but he also, more importantly, restores them to their rightful place in community. He gives them back their dignity as members of a loving community, and he proclaims that their faith has saved them. They are not a punishment, they are not an example, they are human beings who are given the love and mercy of God, as are we when we are sick, as are those whom we love when they suffer and we do not know where to turn. We can turn to doctors and to healthcare professions, and they often could do wonderful things these days to help people's physical illnesses that Jairus' daughter and the woman with the hemorrhage never had access to. But to be truly saved, you have to be more than merely cured. You also have to be healed of the separation from the social circle, and also healed in your understanding of the God who loves you into existence and will love you into his fullness at the end of our time. Jesus' ministry of healing wasn't simply a task he performed to fix illnesses. It was a ministry to which he called all of his followers, and a ministry to which he calls us as well. I'd like to take a little look at our response as Christians, followers of this Jesus, who chose the tradition of the prophets and the poets from the Old Testament and taught us what it meant to be a person of healing and hope. You know, in my extended family, and I should state, I'm one of 44 grandchildren on my mother's side, okay? It's a big extended family. There's lots of healthcare people in there. I've got at least one doctor, lots of nurses. In my own family, medical record keepers and lab workers. My most intimate experience of illness, however, was accompanying my mother, along with two of my closer siblings who live closer, geographically closer, through her journey with Alzheimer's over a period of nearly a decade between the first signs and until her death. We saw the beginnings of loss of memory and confusion, then a long time of normalcy and slowly losing orientation to us and her area, a fractured hip and rehab and years on a memory care unit, and finally her last days of decline and death. And what I'd like to do is take some of the stories, some of the examples from the gospel today of how Jesus is treated, how Jesus dealt with illness, give some examples from my own experience that can hopefully help us to learn better, not only how to seek God's healing in our own lives, but be people of healing for those around us. You know, one of the first obvious lessons is so easy and brief. Try doctors first. You know, the story about the guy who wants to be saved by the flood, and he's going to pray for the miracle, and he sends a truck and a boat and a helicopter, and he drowns, and finally says, God, why didn't you help me out? And he says, well, I send you a boat and a truck and a helicopter. You know, go to your doctors. They're not perfect either, but they often have wonderful things to offer us that, as I said, they didn't have in Jesus' time. And if you don't find relief, keep looking. You might lose all your funding, you know, like the lady did in the gospel. But that was Father Chavez' night to talk about a few nights when we talked about healing from financial stress. Much more importantly, though, for people of faith, once you deal with the medical profession, also reach out to Jesus. That doesn't sound so hard, does it? Yet how many of us like to ask for help? I would bet if we took a survey and said, would you rather offer help to someone else, or would you rather ask for help from someone else? A lot more people would fall in the first category than the second category. Am I right? We're kind of quiet tonight. Are you okay? Are you okay? Maybe we're all sick and that's why we're kind of quiet here tonight. You know, maybe I shouldn't be making too many assumptions here. You know? And look at the two different ways these folks reach out. You've got Jairus, who is, a synagogue official. He's a man of power and prestige, and in Jesus' day, to have that position, he was probably pretty wealthy too. So even though Jesus is in this huge group and preaching, he walks right down to Jesus in front and he says, please help me, my daughter's sick. This is a man with some confidence. You can go to God with confidence. You don't have to hold back. And yet maybe others here are more like the woman with the hemorrhage. Maybe someone or something or some religious tradition that doesn't represent Jesus very well has taught you that you are to be shamed and shunned and not worthy of anything, and you're lower than the scum of the earth, and who are you to be reaching out to the Master? You're unclean, and if you touch him, he's going to be unclean, and then an unclean person like you, lady with the hemorrhage, shouldn't be in this crowd because you're going to render everybody else unclean, is probably what people were thinking when they saw her coming to Jesus. And she doesn't have that power and privilege, and yet she has the faith that forces her through those judgments and says, if I just reach out and touch the hem of his garment, the older translations say. If I could just touch the hem of his garment. What faith in the power Christ has. You might feel privileged, you might feel afraid. Reach out anyway. You've got nothing to lose. And what I love about Jesus, he gives the attention to both, but what Jesus does when he's dealing with the guy who came up first and he's going off to Jairus' house, and the lady comes up and touches the hem of his garment, says, I noticed. I'm going over here first, though. He had the first appointment. I'll get you on the way back. Jesus doesn't do that. Not for the lady with the hemorrhage. Not for you either. God doesn't have to time activate things in Outlook to get them done in the proper order. He can do that. He's God. You can reach at any time. There's no limits. I think of reaching out in prayer and how it has helped so many people. And even, when my mom was going through illness, she had certain prayers that brought her comfort. And as she couldn't say those prayers too much anymore by herself, we recorded masses for her and put them on the VCR player in her room at the memory unit. And and she tapped her foot along with the music. She would have loved the choir tonight, just like the rest of us do here tonight. And one of the things that was so powerful for me, even when she'd had a bad day, the last thing when she went to bed is one of us kids was with her every night. One of us three who lived low closely. So, 2-3 times a week I was there. In my night prayer, I was repeating the prayers with her that she had taught me as a little boy. That was my night prayer. And she would always calm down for those prayers, even in the worst times when she couldn't say or do much else. She knew those prayers touched her soul in a way, even if she couldn't say them with me, they calmed her. And I discovered too, they calmed me as well. The privilege of being able to pray with her, even to the point of her viaticum in the last hours, what we sometimes have called the last rites. It was such a comfort to my family and I to know that we could do that together. Also, think of in the story today, not just that these people reach out, but how Jesus responds. He's not just effective. He certainly is effective, but he's compassionate. He's attentive to the suffering, and he pays attention to the practical stuff. It's not non-spiritual to pay attention to the practical stuff. The last thing he says after the little girl's cured, give her something to eat. Doesn't it sound like something a mom would be more likely to say? Give her something to eat. He's sensitive to the needs of this woman. He can feel someone touching his garment in the midst of that crowd. And when people are reaching out to us for support, can we have that sensitivity to know when somebody's, sometimes we're You ever do that with folks? You just need to gripe a bit and so some people do that. I'm one of them sometimes. Ask the people I live with, they'll tell you. And yet sometimes there's a little different tone of voice or a little different gesture that you notice, especially from one that you know well. That wonderful human sensitivity that says, yes, there's something different here that I need to pay attention to. Can we notice each other and reach out when we can tell someone really needs healing? Parents have this in spades. I'm the youngest kid. I got no younger brothers and sisters. My nieces and nephews are raised at a difference. I can't tell the difference between a kid screaming because they're playing and because they're hurt. But I bet there are a lot of people here who can. That's healing presence. Perhaps the most important thing is that Jesus, for all these people, he restores right relationship. Remember, the woman who was cured of her hemorrhage didn't go away thinking, oh good, this blood stopped, that's over. She was cured of her illness, which means it was possible for her to be clean and accepted in her community again. The stigma that separated her as a person with a flow of blood in the unclean codes of the Old Testament meant she could be with the people of her community and family again. And I love what Jesus calls her before he says, your faith has saved you. Does he say woman? What does he call her? Do you remember? Daughter. Isn't that a much more intimate relationship than woman, person, y'all, It's a language of intimacy. And it's not just restoring to the community, it's intimacy with the Son of God. He has restored her completely. That's what salvation looks like. Not simply physical healing, but salvation. Healing in the big picture. When you're a patient, do you ever feel like you need to claim your dignity? What's your social security number? Last 4 of your social? What's your birth date? Hold out your arm, make a fist, poke. These are all necessary things for our safety. I'm not saying the people who ask these questions are bad. But remember your dignity as you go through health procedures and help others claim that. You are not a number. You are not a policy. You may have a number and a policy, and it's probably good to have them with you when you go to the hospital. But that's not you. You're a person, and you know the doctors and the nurses and the CNA who know the difference, and it doesn't take long to figure it out. Even on the Alzheimer's unit, the memory care unit, I was always amazed at how some of these people who could otherwise be so limited could still show compassion and concern to one another. Because for people of faith, it's stuck in our bones. I think of one little old lady who was there when Mom first got there. Margaret was such a dear heart. She was so kind, and she wanted to talk all the time, and for the life of her, she couldn't make a single sentence that made sense. And she would go around, try to talk to folks, and they'd be kind of nice to her. But she'd walk up to my mom, and my mom would just she would talk to her the way Margaret talked. And they had complete conversations. Nobody else knew what in the world they were saying, but they had complete conversations. There were greetings, there was laughter, there was worry expressed and concern given, and the little goodbye or just little things, just a few minutes, and they both left and they were happy as clams. And as my mom's illness progressed, I remembered how she was with Margaret. And as she would ask questions in which I just couldn't understand, I missed one or two words in a sentence, I learned to do what Mom did, and I would sometimes I would listen to her emotion and craft a response around the words that I did know. And often it worked, but sometimes it didn't. She would, she would mumble something, and the word window was in there, and I said, well, yeah, Mom, the windows are all closed and they're locked at home just where they're supposed to be. Okay, that worked. And then one time she looked at me and says, did you? And then she said something in a very worried tone of voice, 50-50 chance. Well, yeah, Mom, I did it just like that. Well, what did you do that for? Well, because it was my first time, and then I listened the second, then I remembered what you told me, and I did it like that, and it was just fine. Well, okay then. Came out. But one of the most telling ones was when she actually got to the point where some of her sentences I could understand nothing, and all I could get was a worried sound. And she said something worried sounding, and I remembered how she was with Margaret, and I made up some syllables that went along, and they sounded very comforting in my mind. And she looked at me in one of those looks that only parents can give kids when they're in big trouble. And she said, what's the matter with you? I'm the one with a problem. In perfect English. I didn't do that again. I blew it that time. Remember, I said it's about restoring right relationship? I didn't acknowledge the real relationship. She became a topic to respond to and not mother and son. When you're with people who are becoming more and more limited, and this is hard for parents and kids too, because often kids have to care for parents and they say those roles reverse. Let me tell you from experience, you need to let your parents be parents sometimes. And the clearest time I did that made such a difference. She had had a terrible day, and I had had a bad day at work too, and I got over there and it was all the evening and she was ready to go to bed. And finally I decided, I'm going to talk to her just as if she were fine. I said, Mom, you were so strong all those years. You took care of everything, and you were always the one giving orders, and you did such a good job raising us kids, and here you are, and everybody else is telling you what to do. Now, she couldn't speak too much at this point, but all of a sudden, the sigh, and the head went down, and the nod. And then someone acknowledged her truth. She was who she really was. She was a real person with a real past and real talents that just weren't working anymore. And her reality was acknowledged and treasured. And again, she became who she was. And then another time, when I was having a bad day, I told her about it, because moms listen well, And without saying a word, she just, may I borrow your hand, ma'am? Could you just hold it up here? Just like that, yeah. If that was my hand, she just kind of reached out as she could and just patted and stroked it a little bit. as mothers do, as parents do. She was restored to her right relationship. And that was healing for both of us. And it restored her dignity in a way that a sedative never could have. And one of the final memories as she was kind of losing track of who people were, the photos we had in her room were immediate family only, and just a few things she had left on the walls, because people with Alzheimer's or other dementia, related diseases, it takes a lot of energy to use your brain to process visual stuff, and so they often simplify their houses. Things come off the wall, they become more plain. And so when we put things up in her room, it was only immediate family and a couple things she had left up, and she was looking at the photos on the desk, and she would point to one and say, "Who's that?" I said, "Well, Mom, that's Dad when he was a young man before you met him, when he was in World War II. She nodded. "Who's that?" "Well, that's you with all of us kids here. Here's you, and here's your oldest, John, and so and so." We did this for all the photos, and then she pointed to one little picture on the wall that wasn't a family member. It was a little image I gave her of the Madonna and Child. And she pointed to it, and she said, this woman who was very Catholic, okay, she pointed to it and she said, "Who's that?" And I paused for a moment, the priest's son sitting there, "Oh, Mom, that's the Blessed Virgin Mary. That's the Mother of God." And she said, "No shit." It's what she said. If I didn't quote her directly, I'd be dishonoring the fourth commandment. I'm kind of stuck here, okay? That's what she said. And I bit my lip because, you don't correct people with dementia issues. It shames them. So I said, "Yeah, Mom, that's the Mother of God." "No." And she said, "Well, okay then." And she started rolling her chair over to bed. She was ready for bed. And once she knew that, it was okay. And I thought, that may be one of the best responses I've ever heard to the mystery of the Incarnation. We walk around God's grace to us. We walk around God's miraculous healings. And they do occur sometimes, not to everybody. I'll talk about one tomorrow night. We walk like Mohawks up on the tight wires, doing high construction work in New York, as though we're so used to the mystery, we forget how astounding it is that God chose to become one of us. Now, she probably wasn't thinking that theologically, but it sure hit me that way. And I thought, what a wonderful response. You want to be healed of your illness? Let me tell you about somebody who came and was like us in all things except sin, who walked our lives, who lived our suffering. Whatever your healing need is, whether it's poverty or social exclusion or physical sickness, whatever, to the point of being nailed to a cross. That happened for you, that happened for me. This is the love that God gave. And faith saves us. It doesn't just physically fix diseases. It restores us to right relationship in the community of our family, of our social network, and of our faith community, and it restores us as children of God. Mom gave me the gift that night of seeing God's divine humor in the absurdness of life. And let me tell you, if you can't start to see that somewhere, once you get to at least midlife and beyond, you're going to be missing out on a lot of good stuff, because laughter heals. Laughter heals. Chesterton said that angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. Tonight, we may or may not be physically cured of whatever brought us here tonight, but we all sit here, or we gather here assured that we have been loved into existence, embraced by this community, and accepted as we are, even with our imperfections, perhaps even because of our imperfections. And there are many healthy and wealthy people in the world that do not have the gifts you and I have, who are sitting in these pews this moment, this night, and they find their lives without meaning. Tonight, we have that gift of God's presence with us in the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. And this isn't a simple healing service the way we might do in a charismatic prayer meeting or something like this. This is the sacrament of the anointing of the sick, and this is reserved for people who have a serious illness which is normally considered life-threatening, so something that is chronic until death, or significantly life-changing. If I have a cold, it is not significantly life-changing. If I have a compromised immune system with a cold, that could be life-threatening. No one's going to judge whether or not you have such a disease or stand in need of such a healing or anointing. But today we come here and we are not merely, apply to infested area. That's a medical procedure. We are anointed. When else are you anointed? You're anointed at baptism when you're claimed for God. You're anointed with oils then. You're anointed when you're confirmed in your faith. Priests and deacons are anointed at the sacrament of holy orders. And this is not simply a medical procedure. This is an anointing, a claiming for God of our dignity, our goodness before Him who brings us into existence, God's chosen ones in whom He delights.